Now, for those of you who have been watching, and you probably are continuing to watch, there was a video released over the internet called the ZeitGeist, okay? And I'm here to refute a lot of the ZeitGeist, and I will definitely be revisiting this subject because I'm hardly done with this. But what I'm going to present to you is ways that you can rebut the ZeitGeist video. Okay. First of all, I love how these people are not very thorough about their stuff. Okay. They go into these major discussions without being more thorough. We're going to be more thorough here. Now, they bring up the star Sirius and they bring up something called the Three Kings. Okay. First of all, this is referring to Orion's belt. Okay, and this is a compilation of 3 stars. Now, the names of these 3 stars, which they never mentioned in their video, is Omnitak, Omnilam, and Mintaka. Now, I may not have those exactly pronounced right, but those are the 3 names of those particular 3 stars. They don't mention that in the ZeitGeist video at all. So, when you present those particular names, it actually makes you sound a little more intelligent. Means you actually did some of the research on this stuff. Or you basically listened to me, which I did the research, okay? So, the names are Omnitak, Omnilam, and Mintaka. And I hope I pronounced those right, but at least, even if you don't pronounce them exactly right, at least they know you actually did some research. Alright? Now, these stars, okay, are part of a compilation. Right? This is Orion's belt. These 3 stars go under a compilation. Now, it depends on who you talk to as to what they are called. Now, the Afrikaans speakers in South Africa have 2 names for these things. Okay, so if you're talking about the people in South Africa and you're talking about what they call these 3 stars together, then they go by one of 2 names: Drie Konings. Again, that may not be a proper pronunciation, but Drie Konings, which means 3 kings, or Drie Sisters, which means 3 sisters. So it can either mean 3 kings, or it can mean 3 sisters. Question is, ZeitGeist never answers this. Okay? Now, it's also mentioned in Daudet's Letter de Mon Moulin, or Moulin, sorry, Letter de Mon Moulin, and it's by a guy by the name of Daudet, and I believe he's French. And these 3 stars, according to him, are called Les Trois Rois. I'm just presuming that's how it's called, but that's basically it. Now, if you're talking about Dutch, it's known as Drie Koninger. Now, in these 2, I'm presuming that they're thinking it's 3 kings. However, if you go to Spain or Latin America, you find the name Las Tres Marias. Now, Las Tres Marias is the 3 Marys, or the 3 anointed ones. So, the real question is, are these stars the 3 anointed ones, the 3 sisters, or the 3 kings? We don't know. Because it just depends on where you go as to what they are. Even the South Africans can't decide whether it's the 3 sisters or the 3 kings. So there goes argument number 1. Now, argument number 2. Let's continue on with this Orion's belt, because this gets better. Now, all of your stars in the sky rise in the east and they set in the west. Now, the guy is saying that Orion's belt points to the sun coming up in the east. Well, here's the problem with that. From what I'm reading here, Orion's belt descends below the horizon an hour or two before the sun comes up in the east. So how can it be pointing to the sun in the east when it's already below the horizon before it happens? Good question. Now, let's go on with this thing. I've already said in a previous video that I truly believe that it was the Feast of Tabernacles in which Jesus was born. And I've given a lot of good reasons for this. Alright? And if you want to watch the response to that, you just watch the further response to College Humor, and you'll see in that video how I honestly believe that Jesus was born in the Feast of Tabernacles instead of during Hanukkah. Okay? Hanukkah is a minor holiday to the Jews, but the Feast of Tabernacles is a bigger holiday. Alright. So, we've got that now. So, it wouldn't even matter if those were called the Three Kings or not. If the real birthday of Jesus is in the Feast of Tabernacles, then none of this makes any sense. Well, let's go on here. Who were the supposed three kings? It wasn't three. That's another thing. They're saying, well, it's the three kings. Really? Have these people dig in the Bible and find the number 3 to enumerate, okay, that's the word, to enumerate the Magi. Now, who were these Magi? They were sorcerers. They were wizards. They knew astrology. They knew astronomy. That's why they were called the wise men. But they weren't just 3 people. Remember what they were carrying. 3 gifts. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Most likely, they sold the frankincense and the myrrh to get the gold. Okay? These were probably big-time Arab sorcerers and merchants. Okay? And when they talk about coming from the Orient, they're talking about Asia Minor, not Asia Major. Okay? A territory known as Asia Minor kind of borders with the Middle East. Whereas if you're talking Asia Major, you're talking about China, Japan, Korea. Okay? So these Magi are really Arabs. They're not Oriental as you would know the term. Okay? But they were wise and they were very smart. Now, if you're carrying around gold, frankincense, and myrrh, what you're not going to do is you're not going to have 3 people going out in the desert like that because of bandits. They don't mention anything like that in the ZeitGeist video. So see, it's those extra details that makes all the difference. When those Magi went out, they went out in a big band. There might have been 20 or 30 of these guys. Because like I said, they were trading frankincense and myrrh for gold. They don't mention that in the ZeitGeist video either. So, there goes the entire argument in a nutshell. But they say, well, okay, well, we'll forget about the astrology and the astronomy, because obviously you got that one pretty much cornered. They say, well, what about Horus? Well, before we get into Horus, let's think about this for a second. How were things written down in the 1st century? Like this? No, not hardly. Okay? Things were written down usually with papyrus. Okay, there was an actual papyrus plant that grew up, and they snipped it apart and they put it together, and that became their paper. Which, by the way, in case you didn't know, papyrus has a problem. After a certain period of time, if it gets moisturized, it disintegrates. And that's why maybe we don't find a lot of copies of a lot of things like what we would do. You know, papyrus doesn't survive normally 2,000 years. That's a problem. Okay? And then you have to think about the ink. Okay? Now, keep in mind, that parchment, they always talk about writing things in parchment. Parchment was made from animal skins, and it was a lot more expensive. Now, do you think those early first century Christians, being under Roman rule in Jerusalem, would have the kind of money necessary to buy a whole ton of parchment and write the entire Gospels on it? They would have written it on papyrus. Even Paul's letters, I'm pretty sure, were written in papyrus. It's a miracle that they even survived, and as good a condition as they have. So there you go. That's why we have a tough time finding the records of Jesus, because a lot of that stuff was written on papyrus, and after a few hundred years, gone. Especially considering that the Arabs invaded Jerusalem shortly after the crucifixion of Jesus. Okay, now first the Romans came in there and they just destroyed the entire Jewish temple, and then later on the Arabs moved in and just took care of all the rest. That's why you don't find a lot of evidence. Okay? Now, Deo is the Hebrew word for ink. Okay? And what they would do is they take powdered charcoal and mix it with water, and they would make that into a black ink, which then they would use with a quill pen to write on their papyrus. Now, keep in mind, the Jewish tradition was to spread intelligence by word of mouth. These were not a stupid people. If you wanted to spread the gospel from one generation to the next, you would start out by teaching by word of mouth. Keep in mind that the first century Christians were facing a Roman oppression. They had money, but they didn't have the kind of money. And remember, they first had to be scribes in order to write all this stuff down. Secondly, they had to be scribes that could afford papyrus and Deo. Okay? Deo. They had to afford papyrus and Deo. D-E-Y-O. So, you had to find Jewish to Christian converts who owned Deo and papyrus, who had scribe capabilities. That's why those Gospels were written the way they were. Now, do you honestly think that they would have nothing better to do than to sit there and write an imitation theology to another theology on expensive paper? And let me tell you something. Even though papyrus was a lot cheaper than parchment, even though it was cheaper, it's still, you had to have money to buy it. They don't mention that in the ZeitGeist video, and it makes it very important. Because you're thinking to yourself, they really invested a lot of money and a lot of intelligence in making these Gospels. These were well-refined Gospels, done by well-refined scribes. Major investment. So you're telling me they went to a major investment to copycat another theology? I don't think so. Okay? Then they talk about how these New Testament Christians went to places like Alexandria, which is in Egypt, Antioch, which is in Turkey, and I mentioned that in a previous video, and Rome, which is in Italy. They went to all these places to copycat a theology. Now, here's the problem with the Library of Alexandria. Library of Alexandria. Julius Caesar accidentally burnt down the Library of Alexandria in 48 BC. Now, if Jesus was born in 4 BC, and this library was burnt down in 48 BC, how in the world did these Christians get a hold of this material enough to copycat it? But it gets better. Okay? In those days, you didn't just walk into a library like hobos do today and read whatever you liked. No, you actually had to pay a fee to get into those libraries, and you had to be a certain kind of a citizen. Okay? Paul the Apostle could have gotten in there. That's true. Matthew the tax collector could have gotten in there because they were both Roman citizens. But not every Christian could have gotten into the Library of Alexandria. Now you have to keep in mind the distance between Jerusalem, Israel, and Alexandria, Egypt. That's quite a distance. So you're telling me that Matthew the tax collector, Paul the apostle, Peter the fisherman walked all the way from Jerusalem, or rode on a donkey, all the way to Alexandria, Egypt, managed to get into the library, and then made a copycat theology out of those materials. Remember, a lot of those were actually burnt in a fire from Julius Caesar back in 48 BC. Okay? So how were they copycatting something that was burnt up in the, just burnt in the air? Like to know that. So see, this is other reasons why you can debunk all this. They didn't include all this detail in the ZeitGeist video. Didn't include any of it. Okay? Now, not only did they have to travel from Jerusalem, Israel, straight on over to Alexandria, Egypt, but then they had to pay fees to actually get into the library. And if they want to check anything else, they had to actually pay fees to check things out. And remember, they had to return them back. Now keep in mind, though Matthew was a pretty well-off tax collector, and Paul was a pretty well-off Jewish man, okay, because he had associations with the Jewish Sanhedrin prior to his conversion, that didn't mean they were filthy rich. So now you have to factor in transportation costs, and you also have to factor in fees to get in those libraries to check everything out. You have to factor in the cost for the papyrus, and you have to factor in the cost of the ink. That's a major investment. But does ZeitGeist mention any of this? Nope. Okay. Now let's deal with Horace himself. Alright, so they're supposed to be copycatting this Horace. Which version of Horace are we supposed to be copycatting? The pyramid texts, which, by the way, they weren't in the Library of Alexandria. The pyramid texts appear in the tombs of the kings of the pharaohs. Okay? They were actually in the pyramids. Now, how were these... Remember, those pyramids weren't like they are today as tourist attractions. They were all nice and sealed up. Now, how were these Jewish men supposed to get in there to read those works? They didn't. So we exclude all those pyramid texts. How about the coffin text, which I believe would also be in those tombs? How were they supposed to read any of that? They weren't. And then there's the Book of the Dead. Okay, this is the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Jewish men trying to gain access to an Egyptian Book of the Dead. Really? Remember, there had been a long friction between the Egyptians and the Jewish men ever since Moses led the Jewish men out of the country of Egypt. ZeitGeist doesn't mention that. Okay? How were they supposed to get a hold of the great hymn to Osiris? Or the Memphite theology? And which one of these versions is the right version? Nobody knows. Does ZeitGeist mention any of this? No. So how do we know which version of Horace is the right one to go out and then copycat? Beats me. But I'll tell you one thing about Horus. If you follow the story enough, you find out that Osiris was killed. His body was dismembered. And Isis was supposed to have found every piece except the male genitalia, so she made her own phallus version, had relations with it, and out came Horus. Now, for those of you who really pay attention to my videos, you probably have heard this story before, because this is a copycat of yet another story. You're saying Horus is a copycat of something else? Yep. Ever read the story of Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz? Sound familiar? Should. Horus, in that particular respect, is a copycat of Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz. But does ZeitGeist mention any of this? Nope. Now here's the kick. If you read the Old Testament, the worship of Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz was forbidden. Matter of fact, there is a story about Elijah and the Baal worshippers, and Elijah was setting up his altar, and the Baal worshippers were setting up theirs, and God rained fire all over Elijah's sacrificial whatever, and the Baal worshippers, they didn't get their fire started, so the Jews would have absolutely nothing to do with Baal worship. That means they would have nothing to do with Horus, because Horus is an imitation of the Baal worshippers. But does ZeitGeist mention any of this? Nope. With all that extra information, you can completely debunk the ZeitGeist movement in one swift shot. If he can't get any of that information correct, if he's not going to present any of that information, then he's a charlatan. Whoever made that ZeitGeist video is nothing but a charlatan. He was not very thorough. He did not put any of those arguments in his video. So therefore, he's a charlatan. Don't listen to him. You've gotten more from me than you have from them. Now the thing is, when they rebut all of this stuff, they forget to mention some of this stuff. I don't like it when they don't do that, because what happens is they throw, to me, they throw cheap shots. And I'm like, okay, don't throw cheap shots. If you're going to do this, you've got to do it right. So, I've presented enough information here, and like I said, I'll probably revisit this, because I am very, very interested in this. I'd like to just literally trash this ZeitGeist all to pieces. But you see, all of this stuff in itself is enough to knock ZeitGeist right off his hooves. Let's make this guy work for what he's doing. Let's put him back to work. He's got a lot to cover. And by the way, while we're at it, I'm going to pull this up here just a second, because I actually had to deal with, one of the reasons why I dealt with all this is because I had to deal with somebody. It's Hercules2345. I got a message for you. I just beat you. So, hopefully, you'll get educated. Alright, I will tell you more in a future video, so stay tuned.